Chapter 7. The Itch. The following day brought still more names that met the criteria and in larger number, all with vague reference to Dragonmount for the place of birth. Moiraine realized she and Swan would never see a name with "born on the slopes of Dragonmount" attached. The prophecies of the dragon were known to many people, though often known wrongly, especially among the common folk, but the mountain's connection remained in even the most nonsensical versions. No woman would want to admit that she had birthed a son who would channel the power one day with all that entailed, the child of her body doomed to madness and terror. How much less would she admit to bearing a child who might become the dragon reborn? She could not deny Dragonmount entirely, or her acquaintances might call her on it. Yet, near the mountain or inside of it was safe enough. The child they sought would surely be hidden behind such a half-truth. Someone would need to visit each of those women with closer questions, prudently phrased and carefully asked. She rehearsed those questions in her mind, the delicate probing to elicit information while giving away nothing. Rouse the mother's suspicions and she would lie again, and likely run as soon as the questioner's back was turned. It would be playing Desdemar with the world at stake. Far from a task she would relish, yet how to resist imagining. The morning also brought a visit from Tamra, who abruptly walked in just as Moiraine was slipping her little book, bearing a fresh name, back into her belt pouch. She tried to disguise the movement, make it part of her curtsy, a touch of clumsiness brought on by surprise. She thought it well done, yet she held her breath as the Amerlin studied her. Had the other woman seen the book? Suddenly, the notion of asking forgiveness rather than permission seemed very frail. Discovery would gain them neither. In all likelihood, discovery would bring rustication, working on an isolated farm from sunrise to sunset, cut off from friends and studies, forbidden to channel. For novices and accepted, that was the penultimate penalty, one last chance to learn correct behavior before being sent away forever. Far worse than blistered hands, though, it would certainly separate them forever from the hunt for the child. "I'd have thought yesterday would have sated your appetites for boredom," Tamra said finally, and Moiraine breathed again. "Especially yours, Swan." Swan seldom blushed, but her face colored at that. Everyone knew her dislike of clerical work. Copying lines was the punishment she dreaded most. Moiraine put in, "The lists help me govern my thoughts, Mother." Once you began giving misleading answers, they came more and more easily, even to the Amerlin seat. In truth, those thoughts still flashed into her head when least expected, lists or no lists. Thoughts of a babe in the snow and a faceless man. Equally dire, of the Sun Throne. She wanted to beg Tamra to halt that scheme, yet she knew begging would be useless. The tower was no less implacable in its weaving than the wheel of time itself. In both cases, the threads were human lives, and the pattern they made more important than any individual thread. "Very well, child, so long as your studies don't suffer." Tamra held out a folded paper that Moiraine had not noticed, sealed with a circle of green wax. "Take this to Kareen Nagashi. She should be in her rooms. Give it to no one else." As if she would. Some accepted complained, very quietly and very privately, over having to climb the wide corridors that spiraled upward through the tower. But even with a climb halfway to the top, Moiraine enjoyed any errand that took her to the Aja quarters. A great deal could be learned through seeing people where they lived. Even Aes Sedai let their guard down in those circumstances. They did a little at any rate. Enough for one who knew how to listen and observe. The Aja quarters were identical in number of rooms and how they were laid out, but the details differed widely. The impression of a full-sized sword was worked into each of the huge white floor stones of the green Aja quarters. Swords in 24 different styles, single-edged and double, curved and straight. Every door along the hallways was carved with a sword, point up, gilded for the rooms of sitters, and silvered or lacquered for many others. The tapestries on the walls, between tall gilded stand lamps on bases worked in the form of stacked halberds, were of martial scenes, charging horsemen and battles and famous last stands, alternating with ancient battle standards from lands long dead, many torn and stained, and all preserved through the centuries by weaves of the one power. No Aes Sedai had ridden to war since the Trolloc Wars, but when the last battle came, the battle Ajah would ride in the forefront. Until then, they fought for justice where it often could be obtained only through their warders' swords, but that was just what they did while they waited on Tarman Gaiden. Another difference here was the number of men. Not just any men, of course. Warders. Tall or short, wide or slim, even quite stout in one case, they moved like lions or leopards. None wore the distinctive cloak indoors, but the cloak was a mere decoration for a discerning eye. You could see warders in any Ajah's quarters, excepting the Red, but most kept rooms in the guards' barracks or even in the city. Green's warders often lived in the same apartments as the sister. A green-eyed warder who made up for his lack of height through width glanced at her as he strode by quickly as if on an errand. 3 others standing together fell silent at her approach, their quiet conversation taken up again after she passed. One wore silver bells in his dark Arafellan braids, one had a thick Tarraboner mustache, and the third was very dark, perhaps a Tyran or a southern Altaran, yet aside from the grace of their movements, there was another thing they shared with each other, and with the heavy-set man, and with every man to be seen here. Once, while hawking with cousins, she had looked into the eyes of a caped eagle with its ruff of black feathers around its head. Meeting a warder's gaze was akin to that. Not fierce, but full of self-knowledge, absolutely aware of their own capabilities, their capacity for violence. And yet it was a violence in restraint, disciplined by their own wills and their bonds to their Aes Sedai. Here they were simply going about their daily lives. A lean man, his head shaven except for a Shinaran topknot, was resting against a wall with one booted foot up, tuning a fiddle and ignoring the good-natured jibing of another warder, who said that it sounded like a wet cat caught in a net. 2 others, in shirt sleeves, were practicing with wooden swords in a broad side corridor, the bundled lathes clattering with each swift blow. Rena Halfden, who somehow made a square face lovely and a stocky build both elegant and graceful, was urging them on with a wide smile, calling, "Well struck, Waylon! Oh, very well struck, Elias!" For size, they might have been twins, though one was dark and clean-shaven, the other fair with a short beard. Grinning, they moved faster and faster. Their sweat-sodden shirts clung to broad shoulders and backs, yet the pair seemed fresh and untired. Through an open door, Moiraine saw a round-faced warder playing a stately melody on a flute, while gray-haired Jayla Bandevin, an imposing woman despite standing near a hand shorter than Moiraine, attempted to teach a new warder the steps of a court dance. He had to be new, a blushing, pale-haired boy of no more than 20, yet no man gained the bond unless he already possessed all the requisite skills. All save dancing, at least. Kareen's door, bearing a sword lacquered in red, gold, and black, also stood open, with the sounds of merry music coming out. Moiraine had no idea what the lacquering meant or the colors, and she suspected she never would unless she chose the green. That would not be, yet she disliked not knowing. Once she identified something she did not know, the ignorance became an itch on her shoulder blade, just beyond reach. Not for the first time, she filed the swords in the back of her mind, beside many other things seen in Ajah quarters. The itch receded, yet she knew it would return when next she saw these doors. The few tapestries in Kareen's sitting room were scenes of war or hunting, but most of the wall space was given over to bookshelves carved in the styles of half a dozen countries. Along with a few books, they held a large lion's skull and an even bigger from a bear, glazed bowls, vases in odd shapes, daggers adorned with gems and gold, and daggers with plain wooden hilts, one with just the nub of a broken blade. A blacksmith's hammer with the head split in two lay next to a cracked wooden bowl that held a single fat fire drop, fine enough to grace a crown. A gilded barrel clock with the hands frozen at just before noon, or midnight, stood beside a steel-backed gauntlet stained black, with what Moiraine was sure was blood. They and all the rest were mementos of well over 100 years wearing the shawl. Of memories before the shawl, there were few. Just a row of painted miniatures on the wave-carved mantel over the fireplace, showing a plainly dressed, dignified man, a plump, smiling woman, and 5 children, 3 of them girls. They were Carine's family, long since passed into the grave, along with her nieces and nephews and their children, and their children's children, and more. That was the pain borne by Aes Sedai. Families died, and everything you knew vanished, except the tower. The White Tower always remained. 2 of Carine's warders were in the sitting room with her. Massive Careel, whose hair and beard gave him the aspect of a golden-maned lion, was reading a book in front of the fireplace with his boots resting on the ornate brass fender, a feather of blue smoke rising from the bowl of his long-stemmed pipe. Steppen, looking more a clerk than a warder with his narrow shoulders and sad brown eyes, sat on a stool playing a lively jig on a 12-string bittern, fingers flashing as skillfully as any hired musician's. Neither man stopped what he was doing for the arrival of an accepted. Carine herself stood working at an embroidery frame mounted on a stand. It always seemed incongruous to see a green doing needlework, especially when, as now, the subject was a field of wildflowers. How did that accord with the violence and death decorating her walls? A tall, slim woman, Carine looked exactly what she was, her ageless face strong and beautiful, her nearly black eyes pools of serenity. Even here she wore a riding dress, the divided skirts slashed with emerald green, and her dark hair, lightly touched with white, was cut shorter than either Careel's or Steppen's, above her shoulders, and gathered in a thick braid. No doubt it was easier to care for while traveling, cut like that. Carine seldom remained in the tower long before setting out again. Placed her embroidery frame, took the letter and broke the green sealing wax with a thumb. Tamra always sealed her messages to sisters with wax in the Aja color of the recipient. Of all Ajas and none. Whatever Tamra had written was quickly read, and no change came to Carine's face, but before the green finished, Steppen leaned his bittern against a side table and began buttoning up his coat. Careel placed his book on a shelf, tapped the dottle from his pipe onto the hearth, and stuffed the pipe into a capacious coat pocket. That was all, but they were plainly waiting and ready. Despite his sad eyes, Steppen did not look a clerk any longer. They were both leopards awaiting the command to hunt. "Will there be a reply, Aes Sedai?" Moiraine asked. "I'll carry it myself, child," Carine replied, starting for the door with a brisk stride that made her silk skirts rasp softly. "Tamra wants me urgently," she told the 2 warders who were heeling her like hunting hounds. "But she doesn't say why." Moiraine allowed herself a brief smile. As with servants, sisters often forgot accepted had ears. Sometimes the best way to learn was to keep silent and listen. As she was making her way back down along the drafty, spiraling corridor, thinking about what she had learned and trying to ignore the cold, Swan came running up behind her. There were no sisters to be seen, but still. "Another message," Swan explained, "to Aisha Ravaneos. She kept muttering something about urgent, making it a question. I'll wager it was the same as you carried to Carine. What do you suppose Tamra wants with a grey and a green together?" The grey handled matters of mediation and justice, where it came from laws rather than swords, and Aisha was reputed to adhere to the strictest letter of the law, no matter her own feelings, whether pity or contempt, a trait she shared with Carine. And both women had worn the shawl for a very long time, though that could be unimportant. Moiraine might not be so handy with puzzles as Swan, but this truly was like the game of houses. She looked around carefully, including a glance over her shoulder. A maid was trimming the wicks on a stand lamp farther along the hallway, and 2 liveried men, one atop a tall ladder, were doing something concerning one of the wall hangings. There still was not a sister in sight, but she lowered her voice anyway. Tamra wants searchers to look for the boy child. Oh, this changes everything. I was wrong, Swan, and you were right. Right and wrong about what? What makes you think she's recruiting these searchers? How could the woman be so deft with puzzles and not see the pattern here? What matter could be more urgent to Tamra right now than the boy child, Swan, she said patiently, or more secret, so she dares not put the reason on paper. That secrecy means that she believes the Reds cannot be trusted. That is what you were right about. More than that, how many other sisters will at first want to deny that this child really is the one prophesied, particularly if he evades discovery until he is a grown man and already channeling? No, she means to use sisters she is sure of to search for him. Where I was wrong was in thinking he would be brought to the tower. That would only expose him to the Reds and others who might be untrustworthy. Once found, Tamra will send him into hiding. His education will be at the hands of her searchers, the women she trusts most. Swan clapped a hand atop her head. I think my skull will explode, she muttered. You built all that from 2 messages, and you don't even know what they said. I know one thing they said and one they did not. It is simply a matter of seeing the patterns and fitting the pieces together, Swan. Really, you should be able to do it easily. Oh? Elid gave me a blacksmith's puzzle last week. Said she was bored with it, but I think she couldn't solve it. Want to try your hand? Thank you. No, Moiraine said politely, and after a quick look for lurking sisters, stuck her tongue out at the other woman. The next day, Tamra sent 3 more messages. The first went to Malin Arganya, the second to Valera Gorovny, a plump little brown who always wore a smile and seemed to be bustling even while standing still. And the third was to Ludis Danin, a bony yellow, whose long grim face was framed by tightly beaded Tarabonner braids that hung to her waist. None let slip a hint of the message's content, yet all 3 had worn the shawl well over 100 years, and all 3 shared that reputation for strict adherence to the law. Moiraine saw it as confirmation, and even Swan began to believe. 5 seemed too few to undertake the search for the boy child. Day by day, the names entered into their small notebooks filled more and more pages, yet Tamra sent no further messages, at least not by them. Eildra Najaf was raised keeper of the chronicles to replace Gitara, and she might have carried them, or more likely sent them by a novice. For a time, Moiraine and Swan tried keeping an unobtrusive watch on the Amerlin's study and her apartments, taking turns to peek around the edge of the doorway, but Tamra had a steady flow of visitors. Not constant, but steady. Sitters could be dismissed from consideration, since sitters rarely left the confines of the city while they held a chair in the hall of the tower, yet any of the others could have been searchers, or not. It was extremely frustrating for Moiraine, that itch on the shoulder blade, just where her fingers could not reach. Soon enough they gave up attempts to spy. For one thing, there seemed no point. For another, with only 1 copying, recording the names went much too slowly. And Eildra, returning to the Amerlin's study, caught Moiraine lurking in the doorway. White hair was the sole similarity between Eildra and Gitara, and Eildra's was straight and cut as short as Kareen's. The new keeper was lean, her coppery skin turned to leather from long exposure to sun and wind, yet assuredly no one had ever called her a beauty, with her narrow jaw and sharp nose. For jewelry, she wore the great serpent ring alone. Her dress was of blue wool, finely woven but simply cut, and the deep blue stole on her shoulders was no more than 2 fingers wide. A very different woman from Gitara. "What are you looking at, child?" she asked gently. "Just the sisters going in and out of the Amerlin's study, Aes Sedai," Moiraine replied, every word true. Eildra smiled. "Dreaming of the shawl? Perhaps your time would be better spent in study and practice." "We find time for both, Aes Sedai, and this work occupies my mind otherwise. Also true. The search for the boy child occupied every scrap of her mind, not given to thoughts she would rather not have. A faint frown creasing her forehead, Aeldra laid a hand on Waraine's cheek, almost as if checking for fever. Do those other dreams still trouble you? Some of the Browns know a great deal about herbs. I'm sure one will give you something to help you sleep if you need it. Varen Sedai already has. The concoction had a foul taste, but it did help her sleep. A pity it did not help her forget the nightmares that came when she did. The dreams are not so bad now. Sometimes there was no way to use evasion. Good, then. Aeldra's smile returned, but she shook a mildly reproving finger under Moiraine's nose. Nevertheless, daydreaming in doorways is not proper for one of the accepted child. If I see it again, I will have to take notice. You understand me? Yes, Aes Sedai. There would be no more spying. Moiraine began to think she would scream from that cursed itch.